B.F. Skinner and Operant Conditioning. History of Psychology. Professor Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. Of all the individuals we've talked about in this course, B.F. Skinner is the only one that I've ever met, although some of you may have believed that I was old enough to have met Socrates and Plato. Not quite true. I met Skinner when I was a graduate student in the late 1980s at an APA conference in Los Angeles. My mentor, Max Brill, was an arch behaviorist, and I was brought into an audience with Skinner and several other graduate students. I really don't remember much of what he said, but he was a very affable, nice man. And we just kind of talked about psychology in general. Skinner would pass away in 1990, and he was kind of losing it at the last year or so of his life, but he was still an intriguing and engaging man. My undergraduate mentor, Max, told me when I informed him that I had been accepted by the University of Michigan for a doctoral program in personality psychology, that Michigan was an okay school for doctoral work, and it was very prestigious. But in Max's opinion, I should get my doc from Michigan and then go to the pillar of behaviorism in this country, Western Michigan University. Ooh, some colleagues are probably going to get angry with that one, that faux pas. And learn what Max said was real psychology. And I have to admit, to this day, one of my major influences in my work, which is basic research and not applied, is to think about how Fred Skinner construed psychology. So here are some of Skinner's basics and some of my thoughts on the work of B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner's work has permeated popular culture to the extent it shows up on one of my favorite TV shows, The Big Bang Theory. In this clip, Sheldon uses positive reinforcement to condition Penny's behavior. Enjoy. This is one of my favorite cartoons based on Skinner's work. The rats clearly are conditioning the post-grad student. Here's a picture of Fred Skinner in his early days with one of his pigeons. Skinner's pigeons were typically at 80% of body weight when they were conditioned. B.F. Skinner was born in a small Pennsylvania town, originally wanting to be a writer. He earned a degree in English, and his father gave him 1 year to travel and hone his writing skills. During those travels, he read Pavlov and Watson and decided to go into graduate school to study psychology. He completed his doctorate at Harvard University and landed his first academic job at the University of Minnesota. Eventually, he moved around, spending the majority of his academic career at Harvard University. Skinner denied the existence of independent conscious thought. He believed that introspection is merely observation of the body, and that environmental events are those that rise to conscious events. One of Skinner's primary notions was to study what he called the functional analysis of behavior. Now, the functional analysis of behavior refers to an examination of the environment and the organism's behaviors associated with that particular environment. In fact, in behavior therapy, Oftentimes, one of the things therapists look for is what is reinforcing the organism's behavior, and oftentimes they find it's not what they think is leading to behaviors that they wish to change. Skinner says the environment selects the organism's behavior. So, for example, if a poorly behaved child in a classroom is getting positive reinforcement from the other students, but not from the teacher, their behavior may remain poor because those individuals in the environment are reinforcing the negative behaviors that the teacher would like to extinguish. Skinner also says an organism may behave in a variety of different ways in any environment, but only some of them may be reinforced. What reinforces an organism's behavior is one of the main things that Skinnerian behaviorists are concerned with. One of Skinner's main things to use is the good old Skinner box. Rats were typically starved to 80% of body weight before they were put in the Skinner box. Here's Fred Skinner doing a little bit of shaping. Skinner called operant behavior those behaviors that operate on the environment to produce a certain set of consequences. And from his point of view, operant behaviors are emitted by the organism. What the behaviorist does is shape those behaviors that the organism is emitting in systematic ways. For Skinner, the causes of behavior are quite inconsequential. Operant behaviors are controlled by the consequences of that behavior. If that behavior leads to reinforcement, the behavior is strengthened. If not, it isn't conditioned. Operant responses generally increase the rates of behavior for an organism.
And we're going to try another pigeon now, and I will try to pick out some particular pattern of behavior and make it a more frequent part of the repertoire of the bird. Very fine. This bird has been already conditioned to eat when the magazine sounds and the light flashes. Now we'll just watch its behavior a bit. It's not doing anything in particular, you see, but I'm going to try to get it to do something. Suppose I shape up the behavior of making a complete turn. What I do is simply, as I did then, to wait for some part of that behavior. There's more of it, you see. You can see that the effect is instantaneous. I'm waiting for it to turn counterclockwise now. And then I reinforce that movement. And I wait for a more pronounced movement than that. It's got to be more than that. There we go, all the way around.
Skinner called this process shaping. And shaping was done, as you saw in the brief video that we just saw. Sorry for the redundancy there. Through a process called successive approximations. You provide reinforcement after small steps towards the behavior that you want to condition. And eventually you'll get to the more motor behavior that you would like to condition. Skinner used something called the discriminative stimuli to initiate conditioning behavior. When the animal saw the discriminative stimuli, it knows it should start behaving, and that reinforcement is available. A delta stimuli is a stimuli to stop behaving, to no longer emit the shaped behavior. A series of shaped behaviors may be put into a sequence, which is called chaining. If you've ever seen a trained animal perform on TV or in the movies, or maybe in person at some event, you might have seen an animal do several behaviors before it's reinforced. Each one of those behaviors is shaped individually and then placed together in what Skinner called a chain. If you've ever taught your dog to lay down and roll over, that's an example of chained behavior. It includes first teaching the dog to sit, then to lay down, then to roll over. So you see it's a chain of behaviors there. Extinction is pretty much the same as Pavlovian extinction. If you do not provide reinforcement after behavior is shaped, the behavior will go away. And then we have different kinds of reinforcement. In Skinner's model, the most important thing is reinforcement. The most frequently used form of reinforcement is positive reinforcement. And in positive reinforcement, a behavior is strengthened by the consequences of experiencing a positive condition. So the dog is learning to stand on its hind legs, and it's going to get a treat for doing so. Here's an example of positive reinforcement using rat behavior. A hungry rat presses a bar in its cage and receives food. The food is a positive condition for the hungry rat. The rat presses the bar again and again, and each time receives food. The rat's behavior of bar pressing is strengthened by that consequence of receiving food. Negative reinforcement is oftentimes misunderstood and is thought to be the same as punishment. It's actually very different. In negative reinforcement, a particular behavior is strengthened by the consequences of stopping or avoiding a negative condition. So in this cartoon, which may be really applicable today with the recent sheltering in place things we've been through, Kayla's dad gets up and makes a fool out of himself. Every day her math grade is below a B. So her father, will post that video, embarrassing video on YouTube, and hopefully she will stop getting bad grades and start getting better grades. Here's a rat example for you of negative reinforcement. A rat is placed in a cage and immediately receives a mild electrical shock. The shock is a negative condition for the rat. I'd have to say a shock would be a negative condition for me as well. The rat presses a bar and stops the shock. The rat receives another shock, presses the bar again, and the shock stops. The rat's behavior of pressing the bar is strengthened by stopping the negative condition. Both positive and negative reinforcement increase operant rates, one by providing positive reinforcement and the other one by teaching a behavior that involves removing a negative consequence. Punishment is one of those things that is frequently talked about in behaviorist circles, and punishment is different from other forms of reinforcement In fact, it's not even reinforcement, it's just put in the category of the other two. Because punishing weakens the consequence of experiencing a negative condition, supposedly. Let's look at an example here. A rat presses a bar in its cage and receives a mild electrical shock. The shock's a negative condition for the rat. The rat presses the bar again and receives a shock. The rat's behavior of pressing the bar is weakened by the consequence of receiving a shock. And I don't think that you would press a bar if you were going to get a shock either. The same token goes for the child here who obviously has done some behavior, and Dad wants to weaken that behavior, so he's administering corporal punishment. Now, the primary problem with punishment is it usually reinforces the punisher in a positive way. And many punishers, in turn, like to punish, and they find that punishing is a positive condition for them, and they will punish more. This is one of the reasons to go back to a previous slide when Skinner talks about a functional analysis of behavior. You have to look at the environment, what things are getting positively reinforced, what things are being negatively reinforced, and what things are being punished, to understand why behavior happens in a certain way. And again, to emphasize this, the primary punishment problem is that it reinforces the punisher. The punisher gets some kind of positive thing out of that punishment. Skinner believed behaviorism could save the world, and he was prone to look at very many different type of environmental situations or other things that he could apply behavioral techniques to. I call these the Skinner oddities because I think they're unusual applications of his theory, although other folks may not think them quite that odd. One of the things that Skinner pioneered was the use of what he called learning machines. And these machines were very simple devices. They weren't computers, although this one looks like a computer. But they directed behaviors based on branching correct and incorrect answers. These techniques were also used in books and other kind of learning tools. Later, with the development of especially personal computers, behaviorists were able to apply these techniques to computers and probably mobile devices, although I haven't checked out that one yet. One of the more bizarre things that Skinner did was design something called the Aircrib. Now remember, the environment is really, really important to Skinner. It's of paramount importance. So he believed that infants should be kept in an optimal environment, and that the traditional baby crib does not provide that. If you look at this picture and the next couple of pictures, you see Skinner's Aircrib. It is a very controlled environment. It's basically a large wooden box. It has a sliding window that comes down. It is temperature controlled to keep the baby at an optimal temperature. Now the baby here has a diaper because, well, this is a 1950s picture. Need I say more? And in the Aircrib, Skinner believed the baby should be placed in there naked. In the next picture, you'll see a little bit of it, but there is underneath the baby a roll of fabric that essentially becomes the diaper. When the baby soiled the material, it simply was pulled down and put into a diaper-type bin. The air was filtered and air-conditioned. Remember that in the 1950s and 60s, air conditioning was not prevalent in homes. And so Skinner was looking for the optimal environment to raise children in. And these were eventually manufactured by a company called Aircrib. Skinner kept one of his daughters in these devices. And there are many myths and urban legends about Skinner around, but one of them was that Skinner's daughter kind of went a bit off the deep end. I'm not a clinician, so I can use words like that. And had some psychological problems in adulthood. And she sued him for keeping her in this environment. Those are strictly myths. They're categorically wrong. If you look on the PowerPoint, I have a snippet from an article by Deborah, and she totally discounts the bad effects of the Aircrib and touts how Fred Skinner was a great dad. Here's another picture of it with Debbie Skinner at 11 months. It's soundproof, it's dirt-proof. Temperature was kept at 78 degrees. Humidity was kept. She was always at the right temperature. She doesn't look too distressed there. If you look in the bottom left corner, you can see the roller sheet that was pulled down and lasted about a week and then simply was laundered and replaced. And she certainly doesn't look unhappy in the Aircrib. I think the thing that, from any point of view, I find most intriguing is Skinner's notion of using pigeons to fly guided weapons during World War II. And this was called Project Pelican. Now, I'm a World War II buff, so a combination of Skinner and conditioning and some World War II stuff is just way too intriguing for me. So let's look at Project Pelican. Here is the Pelican. It was to be a guided munition. Now you have to remember, during World War II, we did not have any guided munitions like we do now. There weren't any smart bombs. They just kind of fell where they were. And the military was desperately attempting to come up with some kind of system to maneuver munitions to their targets without people involved so that no one would get hurt. So this is the flying bomb that Skinner devised an ingenious guidance system for. And basically what he did was he trained pigeons, not pelicans, to peck at certain things on a screen. And it could be a ship, it could be an aerial map or an aerial photograph, of a city, and the pigeon would be trained to peck at maybe a certain factory. And the guidance system would then move to change the control systems on the missile so that it, in turn, flew to target. Naturally, the birds didn't realize that they were flying into a target kamikaze style. The pigeons were trained to peck at a certain area on a map or reconnaissance picture, as I just said. Got ahead of myself. And this worked extremely well. Skinner demonstrated it to the powers that were in charge of the Army Air Corps at the time. The government even gave him money to develop this project. The generals watching the Pelican perfectly guide a mock-up to its target were very impressed, but they couldn't see having them fly their bombs with a pigeon. One of the criticisms was, well, what if the pigeon gets distracted or sees another bird, or things like that? So Skinner developed a more complex version of the Pelican, where 3 birds were placed in the nose of the Pelican, and 2 of them had to peck at the right spot of the 3, and then the jury, the majority of the opinion, would change the flying characteristics of the missile or bomb and move it to its target.
If somebody says to you, pigeon-guided missile, the first thing you say is, what? It doesn't make any sense. Pigeons come home. Wrong place for a missile.
But genius sees things differently. At the height of World War II, the Allies needed a guidance system that could target enemy warships. They found the answer in Harvard, and it was truly weird. Meet B.F. Skinner, Harvard professor and world authority on human and animal behavior.
B.F. Skinner was one of the great minds in psychology.
He actually pioneered positive and negative reinforcement, the basis of all animal training.
Skinner was probably the greatest psychologist of the 20th century. Some people think Sigmund Freud was, but he was really a neurologist.
After years of studying animals in the lab, Skinner discovered a priceless military secret. If a smart weapon needs a smart pilot, then pigeons are the top guns. They have exceptional eyesight. Their brains can process visual information 3 times faster than a human's. And, most importantly, they can be trained.
They're very smart. If someone tries to insult you and say you're a bird brain, my response would probably be, thank you.
Skinner trains his pigeons using positive reinforcement. If it makes the right response, like pecking when it's told to, the pigeon gets a reward. Using this method, he trains them to complete incredibly complex tasks. He even teaches them to play ping pong. Project Pigeon gets full military funding. And Skinner comes up with a groundbreaking missile design. The pigeon's head is squeezed into a sock, and is placed in the missile where it can see the target ship through the windows. When the missile goes off course, the pigeon pecks at the target ship. The pecking controls the tail fins, bringing the missile back on target.
He's not thinking, I want to get that target, right? But he is going to keep pecking when the target stays on the center, because that's when he was getting his food during training.
A metal conductor was attached to the bird's beak to transmit its pecks to the guidance system. This footage shows Skinner's actual testing, using projected images of enemy ships. The pigeons hit the target with near-perfect accuracy.
B.F. Skinner proved, beyond a shadow of doubt, that a pigeon-guided bomb would work.
Even though it tested well, the U.S. High Command simply could not bring themselves to trust their bombs to bird brains. Luckily for the pigeons, they pulled the plug. The super psychologist was ultimately stymied by a simple lack of trust.
But wouldn't you love to see it? Imagine taking out the enemy with a pigeon. That's gotta be worth seeing.
The Pigeon project was suspended and eventually didn't go forth because it was superseded by the electronics guidance systems we see for musicians today. The video you just saw was fairly accurate, had one error. It only showed one pigeon in the nose of the pelican when there were really slots for 3. But it's a TV show called Weird Weapons and looked at some oddities from World War II, and you can't expect 100% accuracy. Here are some of my bad computer animations of this process. So the bird is standing behind a plexiglass screen. That plexiglass screen has some servos attached to it. When the pigeon sees the target moving, pecks at the center, moves the servos, which reposition the fins of the missile and guide it to target. Here is a picture of the Pelican Warhead. You can see the 3 cradles for 3 different pigeons. Here's another picture of the device early on. And I couldn't resist putting this picture in there as well. I think that anyone who's been really bombed by a pigeon knows that they have startling accuracy for such things. Now, the Russians also attempted to do something similar. They conditioned dogs to run underneath tanks with explosive devices that were magnetic. The dog ran under the tank. The magnetic charge was detonated, blowing up the tank. Fortunately for the dogs, the Russians didn't do this very well, as they used their own tanks to train the dogs to run underneath. And they quickly suspended the program because the dogs were running under the Russian tanks, not the German tanks, as they intended. Here's a picture I just found with a pigeon and a real pelican. You have your own editorial comments on that choice. Our final Skinner tidbit is that he wrote a novel. After becoming a frustrated novelist in his youth, he wrote Walden 2, which was based on the development of a utopian society. And a small group of Skinnerian followers actually attempted to develop a society like this in a rural area of the United States. And it worked for a while. However, there are always cheaters and deceivers in utopian societies, and it kind of fell through. I've attempted to read Walden 2 on several occasions, and the only thing I can tell you is Skinner was a much better psychologist than he was a novelist. As a materialist and a monist, I am still very enamored with the work of B.F. Skinner. It's been applied to a variety of settings, and I think behavior therapy is one of the most powerful uses of behavioral technology and psychology. So we've seen a bit on Skinner, although we've just touched bases. We haven't talked about how his work has been applied to behavior therapy. We haven't talked about such fundamental things as schedules of reinforcement and all that other stuff. But I hope from this brief presentation you get a kind of feeling for how important Skinner has been to psychology, and hopefully you'll take this away as part of your learning from our History of Psychology course. Bye now. This has been a We Have Couches video production. 2020, copyright Professor Michael Botwin, All rights reserved. Hopefully this has been a positively reinforcing experience for you.